York, this is Democracy Now!
Why are our children scared to death of people that are supposed to protect and serve them?
The family of Jacob Blake held a sit-in outside the Kenosha Police Headquarters in Wisconsin to protest the return to work of the officer who shot Jacob Blake 7 times in the back in front of his 3 young children, leaving him partially paralyzed. The Blake family is calling for the officer to be fired. We'll speak with Jacob Blake Sr. Then we look at how state Republican lawmakers across the nation are pushing bills to criminalize protests.
Since the killing of George Floyd last summer, over 90 bills have been introduced in 35 states that would restrict the right to peaceful assembly. Plain and simple, these bills are a threat to our constitutional rights.
Many of the bills give immunity to drivers who hit demonstrators with their cars. We'll speak with the mother of Heather Heyer, who died when a white supremacist rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters in Charlottesville in 2017. Then, President Biden makes history by recognizing the mass killing of Armenians in 1915 as genocide. We'll speak with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Armenian-American poet Peter Balakian, author of The Burning Tigris, The Armenian Genocide and America's Response. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. India remains the global epicenter for COVID-19, reporting a record number of cases for the 5th straight day today with nearly 353,000 new infections. Another 2,800 deaths were also reported, pushing the total death toll to over 195,000, though the true number is expected to be much higher. Hospitals are overwhelmed with oxygen and other supplies running out, forcing health workers to turn away patients.
I came here to get my grandfather treated. He is suffering from COVID-19. They are not letting us in. We don't understand anything. The guard here is saying there is no doctor available here. If there's no doctor near the emergency ward, then where will we go? His oxygen level is dropping alarmingly.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi came under renewed fire this weekend after news that Twitter agreed to a request by his government to block critical tweets about his response to the pandemic. Meanwhile, several countries have offered to help India battle its devastating surge. The U.S. said it would send medical treatments, testing kits, ventilators, personal protective equipment, and possibly oxygen supplies. Some, including Ashish Jha, the dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, are calling for the Biden administration to send the U.S. excess vaccine supply to India, the tens of millions of AstraZeneca vaccines it has in storage. In Iraq, a fire at a Baghdad hospital creating COVID patients killed at least 82 people Saturday, most of them patients. The blaze was sparked by an exploding oxygen cylinder. The hospital had no smoke detectors, sprinkler system, or fire hoses. This is a family member of one of the victims.
Shouldn't there be supervision over the hospital, ministerial supervision, a supervising authority? This is neglect. Neglect. A hospital burns and there are no firefighting trucks immediately available on site.
In Thailand, officials have shuttered museums, libraries, gyms, parks, and other public venues in Bangkok after reporting new records in COVID cases and deaths. Japan's declared its 3rd state of emergency just 3 months ahead of the Tokyo Summer Olympics. New restrictions on bars and restaurants were announced for Tokyo and other major cities, but officials are resisting a full lockdown. Morocco's condemned Spain for treating Brahim Ghali, the leader of the Polisario Front for COVID-19. The Polisario movement is fighting to establish an independent state in Western Sahara, which was colonized by Spain in the 19th century and annexed by Morocco in 1975. In other international news, the European Union says it'll let vaccinated U.S. tourists visit the region this summer after more than a year of barring all non-essential travel. Here in the United States, many states resumed administering Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine over the weekend after the Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration ended an 11-day pause on its use. Researchers were investigating the vaccine's link to an extremely rare blood clotting condition. This is Janet Woodcock, acting FDA commissioner.
Together, both agencies have full confidence that this vaccine's known and potential benefits outweigh its known and potential risks in individuals 18 years of age and older.
Federal officials said patients, particularly women under the age of 50, should be given a warning about the vaccine. Over 1/3 of U.S. adults are now fully vaccinated, with over half partially vaccinated, but the rate of vaccination has slowed down over the past week. Some states are turning down or reducing new vaccine shipments as supply has started to outpace demand. There is now a growing number of people who are not taking the second vaccine. In North Carolina, the family of Andrew Brown, Jr., who was shot dead last week by police officers serving an arrest warrant, may finally see the body cam footage of their loved one's killing today. At least 7 sheriff's deputies in Elizabeth City have been put on leave, and calls are mounting for the sheriff to step down. Andrew Brown's son spoke during a news conference with civil rights leaders Saturday.
I never expected this to happen so close to home. He left a close and tight family with each other every day, talking to each other every day. And we, my brothers, my sisters, we is what drove him as a person. We is what made him better. And now I gotta live every day, my newborn, without even getting a chance to meet him at all. And that's gonna hurt me every day. I just want justice.
Meanwhile, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, protesters gathered over the weekend following news that police officer Rustin Shesky would return to work. Shesky, who is white, fired 7 shots at point-blank range into the back of 29-year-old African-American father Jacob Blake last August in front of 3 of his children. We'll have more on this after headlines with Jacob Blake's father, Jacob Blake Sr. In Maryland, officials say they'll review all cases of police-involved deaths that were handled by ex-chief medical examiner Dr. David Fowler, who testified in Derek Chauvin's murder case. Fowler said the murder of George Floyd was not a homicide despite the overwhelming evidence. He's been sued by the family of 19-year-old Anton Black, a black teen who died in 2018 after he was electrocuted with a taser and pinned down by 3 white police officers. In Virginia, a black man was hospitalized after he was shot by a sheriff's deputy who responded to a 911 call. Less than an hour earlier, that same sheriff's deputy drove that same man, Isaiah Brown, home after Brown's car broke down. Isaiah Brown was unarmed, was holding a cordless phone in his hand when the officer fired 7 shots at him. Brown's family said he was on the phone with 911 when the police shot him. President Biden became the first U.S. president to officially recognize the early 20th century massacre of Armenians by Ottoman Turks as a genocide. Biden made the recognition Saturday in a proclamation marking Armenian Remembrance Day. On April 24, 1915, the Ottoman Empire began a systematic, premeditated campaign targeting the Armenian people, an unarmed Christian minority living under Turkish rule. More than 1 million Armenians were exterminated. Another 1 million fled into permanent exile. Turkey decried Biden's decision and summoned the U.S. ambassador in Ankara in protest. We'll have more on Biden's recognition of the Armenian genocide later in the broadcast. The Pentagon says it has begun the first stages of its withdrawal from Afghanistan and will gradually turn over control of U.S. military bases to Afghan forces. Sunday's announcement by Army General Scott Miller came as the Taliban reiterated its call for all foreign forces to leave Afghanistan by May 1st, the deadline agreed upon by President Trump during peace talks in 2020. Earlier this month, President Biden rolled back the U.S. withdrawal to September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The UN released an urgent call for action after a shipwreck off the coast of Libya claimed an estimated 130 lives this week. It was the largest tragedy in the central Mediterranean since the start of the year. 2021 has seen at least twice as many deaths along the dangerous migration route as the same period last year. The UN is calling on nations to strengthen search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, to stop returning refugees to dangerous countries, and to allow for safe disembarkation procedures. Israel's military launched airstrikes on the besieged Gaza Strip late Friday, targeting what it said were underground tunnels and rocket launchers. The airstrikes came as Palestinians fired dozens of rockets into southern Israel over the weekend. The violence followed Israel's decision to close Jerusalem's Damascus Gate to Palestinians during the holy month of Ramadan. On Sunday, thousands of Palestinians celebrated. Israeli authorities removed barriers and reopened the gate, capping days of clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters. On Thursday, hundreds of ultra-nationalist Israelis marched through central Jerusalem, chanting "Death to Arabs." This is Palestinian resident Osama Barham.
The violations during Ramadan and terrorizing the worshippers and threatening to burn any Arab through WhatsApp chat groups that belong to far-right Israelis. The residents of Jerusalem had to react in aim to defend themselves and not in aim to attack.
Indonesia's military has located the wreckage of an Indonesian Navy submarine with all 53 crew members aboard presumed dead. The submarine broke into 3 pieces and settled at the bottom of the Bali Strait at a depth of 850 meters. An Indonesian admiral said the Navy lost contact with the 44-year-old submarine Wednesday ahead of a planned torpedo drill and that the vessel likely suffered an explosion. Back in the United States and Louisiana, State Senator Troy Carter won the special election to fill the seat left open by Cedric Richmond when he joined the Biden administration earlier this year. Troy Carter, a centrist Democrat, beat out State Senator Karen Carter Peterson, who is backed by progressives and received an endorsement by New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Once Carter is sworn in, Democrats will widen their margins slightly with 219 House members versus 212 Republicans. In entertainment news, a scaled-down Oscars ceremony was held in Los Angeles Sunday evening with some historic wins. Chloe Zhao became the first Asian woman and only second woman ever to win the Academy Award for Best Director for Nomadland. The film also won Best Picture. Yoo Jung-yoon became the first Korean to win an acting Oscar for her role in Minari. Daniel Kaluuya won Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal of Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton in Shaka King's Judas and the Black Messiah. Trayvon Free and Martin Desmond Rowe won Best Short Film for Two Distant Strangers, which follows a black man reliving his killing by a police officer over and over. The co-directors wore tuxedos with the names of black victims of police violence emblazoned on their lining. Trayvon Free gave an emotional speech as he accepted his award.
Today, the police will kill 3 people. And tomorrow, the police will kill 3 people. And the day after that, the police will kill 3 people, because on average, the police in America every day kill 3 people, which amounts to about 1,000 people a year. And those people happen to disproportionately be black people. And, you know, James Baldwin once said, the most despicable thing a person can be is indifferent to other people's pain. And so I just ask that you please not be indifferent. Please. Don't be indifferent to our pain.
And the pioneering freeform radio host and counterculture icon Bob Fass has died at the age of 87. For more than 5 decades, Bob hosted the program Radio Unnameable in New York, which first aired on Pacifica station WBAI in 1963. Bob Fass's program played host to a number of legendary musicians, including Carly Simon, Odetta, Phil Ochs, Joni Mitchell, and Bob Dylan.
This is Bob Fass. We're back on here with radio. And remember I told you about 10 minutes ago that we were going to have somebody come up who wasn't Shirley Temple? No,
come on, don't do this to me.
What am I doing?
How am I supposed to do it? I'm not going to apologize for not being Shirley Temple.
You want me to introduce you like Mike Wallace?
No.
This is Bob Dylan. I can't say who it is? Oh, all right. Okay.
That was Bob Fass and Bob Dylan. To see our interview with Bob Fass talking about that conversation, Radio Unnameable, live radio, and so much more, go to DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Relatives and supporters of Jacob Blake staged a sit-in outside the Kenosha Police headquarters in Wisconsin Sunday to protest the department's decision to allow police officer Rustin Sheskey to return to work. Last August, Sheskey, who's white, fired 7 shots at point-blank range into the back of Jacob Blake as the 29-year-old African-American father leaned into his car. Inside the car were 3 of Blake's sons, aged 3, 5, and 8. Jacob Blake miraculously survived, but was left partially paralyzed. The shooting of Blake sparked days of protests in Kenosha. Sheskey had been on administrative leave, but he recently started working a desk job for the department. At least 3 protesters were arrested Sunday, including Jacob Blake's uncle, Justin Blake, for blocking the doors to the police station. Demonstrators were calling for Officer Sheskey to be fired and for the release of more information into the department's internal investigation that cleared the officer. This all comes 5 months after the district attorney in Kenosha announced no charges would be filed against Sheskey. In March, Jacob Blake filed a lawsuit against the officer, claiming his actions were, quote, excessive and unnecessary. We're joined now by Jacob Blake Sr., the father of Jacob Blake. He was in Kenosha but is now back in Chicago. Jacob Blake, thanks so much for being with us. Talk about what happened yesterday, and also, how is Jacob? How is your son?
We found out about, I'd say, 11 days ago that he went back to work, and we planned on the 12th day to stage a rally. And at that time, we all decided that we would have to go a step beyond a rally to get enough attention, that there's been so many injustices carried on through this investigation. And Amy, thank you for having me again.
So your brother, Jacob's uncle, was arrested, Justin Blake?
Right. Justin, I forget the reverend's name, and there was a young lady. They were all arrested.
So can you talk about how you learned this? Is it true that, well, let me go to a statement earlier this month. Kenosha's police chief said in that statement, quote, Officer Sheskey acted within the law and was consistent with training. He was found to have been acting within policy and will not be subjected to discipline. Although this incident has been reviewed at multiple levels, I know that some will not be pleased with the outcome. However, given the facts, the only lawful and appropriate decision was made. So that's what the Kenosha police said. Sheskey was returned to work in the midst of the Chauvin trial. How did you learn that he's back, and what are your demands right now?
We learned that he was back through... So just like everybody else did, we didn't know. And then we found out, our law team found out, but our demand is for him to be fired. And we're demanding an understanding of where his weapon was that was fired at my son. They mislocated, the weapon is gone. So we're calling for the Department of Justice to come in as an outside entity to investigate what's going on in Kenosha.
Have you spoken with anyone in the Biden administration? I mean, clearly Merrick Garland, the new Attorney General, is investigating a number of police departments now, reconsidering consent decrees, reimposing them, and particularly, for example, looking at the Minneapolis Police Department after the murder of George Floyd?
Well, if you didn't know, Amy, I was sick after President Biden's inaugural. I was hospitalized for some 8 weeks, and I did not get a chance to follow up, but we are definitely going to follow up with the Biden administration, and we will be speaking with them later on this week.
I'm very sorry to hear that you were sick. How is your son? How is Jacob right now? And where is he?
As of yesterday, Amy, he's in great spirits. We talk all the time. We text each other all the time. When I go see him, I went to see him after I got out of the hospital on my birthday, and you know, he's a fighter. He's a fighter, and he's not going to give up, and he's continuing to be lifted up. So he's in much better spirits than he was, still paralyzed from the waist down.
And then, of course, there's Kyle Rittenhouse. After the shooting of your son by the police officer, the Black Lives Matter protest, Kyle Rittenhouse murdered 2 people in the streets and was allowed... Go ahead.
And maimed another and was allowed to go home. They gave him water and a high five. I don't get it. I don't get it at all.
And now news of officers, because of a leak, it's known that officers are raising money for his legal support.
Well, I mean, my pillow guy, $2 million, and Ricky Schroeder followed up the money. I mean, is hatred the thing now? That's the thumbs up thing now, I guess. To hate my people because they look like I look. I'm so perplexed, Amy. It's like there's 3 or 4 different Americas. There's definitely 2 justice systems. But then there's other, the people that were arrested with my brother yesterday were white.
The latest news from the New York Times, a police lieutenant in Virginia fired this week after he contributed $25 to a legal defense fund and expressed praise for Kyle Rittenhouse, the teen who killed 2 people during the protests in Kenosha. The Lieutenant William Kelly, a member of the Norfolk Police Department for nearly 19 years, was relieved of his duty last Tuesday by city officials. I wanted to then ask you very quickly before we go, Jacob Blake, about what's happening in your home state of North Carolina. Protests erupting, demanding justice for Andrew Brown Jr., the black man shot dead by Elizabeth City police officers serving an arrest warrant Wednesday morning. Eyewitnesses described an unlawful, unjustified killing by multiple officers who opened fire as Brown tried to flee in a vehicle. This is Brown's neighbor and longtime friend.
I've got my neighbor across the street killed, and my baby comes running in my room with fear in his face. Like, how do I keep him safe if the people that are supposed to serve and protect us and keep us safe are the ones taking him out?
A family lawyer said Brown was unarmed and demanded the release of police body camera footage. And apparently today, the family will be viewing body camera footage after just enormous protests.
Well, our counterparts flee all the time, but they make it to jail. When a black man seems to flee or not pay attention, it's murder. You're dead. And I don't understand that either.
And finally, your response to the verdict in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. Derek Chauvin convicted of murdering George Floyd.
Well, had that, young lady not been there with the camera the whole time, none of this, you understand, none of this would have happened. It would have been just say, hearsay, she say, they say, but you saw what happened. The jury saw what happened and came to the correct conclusion. And that's a step in the right direction, a small step. There's so many steps that we have to take because it's been 68 murders since that court case started.
Well, Jacob Blake, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Jacob Blake Sr., the father of Jacob Blake Jr., shot 7 times in Kenosha, Wisconsin by a white police officer. All health to you and to your son. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to look at a slew of laws pending in Republican-led state legislatures that criminalize protest. According to the International Center for Nonprofit Law, 81 anti-protest bills have been introduced in 34 states so far this year. 3 bills aimed at limiting protests have already been signed into law. More are expected soon. Arkansas and Kansas have passed measures that target protesters who seek to disrupt oil pipelines. Last Monday, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed a controversial law that's widely viewed as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Under the new law, which went into effect immediately, a public gathering of 3 or more people can be classified as a riot. Anyone who willingly participates in such a gathering can be charged with a 3rd-degree felony. The law also raises the charge for protesters who destroy historic structures, including flags and memorials and Confederate statues, to a felony. It grants civil immunity to drivers who run their cars into crowds of protesters, even if the driver kills someone. During a signing ceremony for the new law, Governor DeSantis noted it will also require cities to receive approval from the state before they cut their police budgets.
Prevents against local governments defunding law enforcement. We'll be able to stop it at the state level. And if you look at some of these places that have done this, they've already seen crime go up, even just diverting some of the funding to this. And so it's an insane theory. It's not going to be allowed to ever carry the day in the state of Florida. And this bill gives us the tools to make sure that that doesn't happen.
This comes as a study by the Washington Post found the overwhelming majority of Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful, with more than 96% involving no property damage or police injuries. The Post also reported police officers or counter-protesters often instigated violence. Meanwhile, many anti-protest bills pending in other states have the exact same language as the Florida plan. Some of the laws were drafted with support from the Conservative American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, including so-called critical infrastructure bills aimed at criminalizing protests against the fossil fuel industry. For more, we go to Washington, D.C. to speak with Nick Robinson, senior legal advisor at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which has been tracking these anti-protest laws and found with these latest examples, 17 states have now enacted at least 30 anti-protest bills and executive orders. Nick, welcome to Democracy Now! The Republican legislatures are calling them anti-riot laws. But explain how extreme they are, starting with Florida, which is already being sued, Ron DeSantis, the governor, being sued.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As you say, these are really extreme laws, and what they do is, as in Florida, they expand the definition of rioting, so it's incredibly broad. So, for example, in Florida, under this new bill, let's say you just go to a protest and a handful of people, kick over a trash can. Just by being part of that crowd, you can be arrested and prosecuted for rioting and face a felony. And further, actually, under the law, no one actually has to commit any violence at all. So if there's just a danger to property, then people can be arrested for rioting. So this is just a really super subjective standard that can be used to target protesters. So let's go through, for example, in Florida, what
each of the parts of the law are everything from saying that protesters can't get bail, they have to stay overnight, they're charged with felonies, and then, and we're seeing this in Florida as well as all over the country. This is astounding. 81 laws in the last few months being put forward across the country that drivers who hit protesters with their cars, run them over, will not be found liable.
Yeah, no, so this is just, it's really chilling for protesters. And we see this in state after state after state, these bills being introduced and now getting passed, like, as you mentioned, in Florida, in Oklahoma, a bill that's about to get passed in Iowa. So, for example, in Florida on this rioting provision, if you're with 26 or more people or you're obstructing traffic, it becomes a felony and an aggravated riot punishable by 15 years in jail. Right. So that's just chilling. People already are concerned about being able to go out and protest now under this law because they just don't want, this is a life-altering charge if you get this against you. There's 5 years in jail if you deface a monument. So let's say you tag a Confederate monument or something like that. Again, a super serious charge under the Florida bill. It also says, as you pointed out, that even if you intentionally hit a protester, if you can show if you can claim that protester was engaging in a riot, then you get civil immunity from a civil suit. And as I said, the problem with the Florida bill, like so many anti-riot acts around the country, is they're just incredibly broad and they can capture peaceful protest activity. So we're just seeing this trend across the country, including these driver immunity bills. So we've seen at least 15 bills introduced that would create new immunity for drivers who hit protesters with their car. So the one in Florida, this bill that just got passed in Oklahoma, there's a bill in Iowa that's about to be passed.
In Iowa?
Yes.
And what's going to be happening there?
Yeah, so in Iowa, there's a bill that if you hit a protester with your car and it's during an unpermitted protest in a street, you're immune from civil liability. And just to take a step back to understand, there's a real serious problem of protesters in Black Lives Matter protests this past summer or into today being hit by cars. So I know you already mentioned at the top of the hour the tragedy in Charlottesville when a neo-Nazi purposely ran his car into a crowd of protesters. But we've seen dozens of instances like this around the country of protesters being hit by cars, often intentionally. And instead of taking steps to protect protesters, which is what needs to happen right now, we're seeing these state legislatures introduce bills that would instead protect drivers. And so this is just kind of asking for violence.
I mean, I want to bring into this conversation right now Susan Bro, whose daughter, Heather Heyer, was tragically killed in 2017 when a white supremacist plowed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the one where all those white supremacists marched, chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." Well, Susan Bro is the president and board chair of the Heather Heyer Foundation. She's joining us from Ruckersville, Virginia. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Susan. It's so good to have you back. Unfortunately, under these circumstances, talking about granting immunity to drivers, sometimes just civil, other times civil and criminal immunity to drivers who plow into crowds or run over protesters, well, presumably like your daughter, Heather. Can you respond to this, Susan?
Well, it's declaring open season. It's a hunting license. It's what it basically is. And as I've said on other shows, what's next? Baseball bats, guns? What kind of weapons of mass destruction are they willing to allow? This is blatantly a violation of First Amendment rights of people to protest. I would always go so far as to say people who get jailed for protesting peacefully, especially our political prisoners. If you've got people facing felony charges, they're mandatory overnight, without bail, held until trial, and then looking at 5 to 15 years for protesting, that sounds almost like political prisoners, really.
Can you take us back to 2017, to this time of the protest, when your daughter, Heather, decided to go out? She didn't often go outside and get involved with protests, but this time she did. Can you talk about why she did? And then what happened to her? I hate to take you through this, but it's so important
I
for
go through it every single day.
It's so important now that it's being raised again all over the country to defend the motorists who do this. Now, in this case, the killer was charged with murder, the white supremacist who plowed into the crowd. But tell us what happened, why Heather decided to go outside.
She had seen footage of the Tiki Torch March the night before. Her friends were there and had live streamed it. She saw that and she said, I have to go. I have to go stand in support. Now, she was a lover, not a fighter. She was not interested in being involved in any of the violence or the face-to-face clashes. She and a great many other people were on the opposite side of the downtown pedestrian mall and stayed away from the violence, and were actually returning to the downtown mall because the rally had been disbanded. People had left. She had actually stopped in the parking lot and tried to engage one of the young women in conversation on the way back, and the young woman just kept saying, "No comment, no comment." And they were relaxed. They were chanting. They were singing. It was a jubilant mood from the videos that I've seen. And he sat at the top of the hill with no one around him. He obviously had a way to get back out of there, even though the way forward had been barricaded on one side, because he quickly exited once he attacked the crowd. 35 people were injured. And, I originally said under the new laws, this would not have applied, but after hearing further definition, I don't know, they maybe would have tried to apply this law to him.
You have that famous photograph of the moment of impact with the protesters, some of them hurled into the air.
Heather's friends were hurled into the air. The young gentleman whose shoe was seen dangling from the front bumper of the car as he retreats was Heather's friend.
Marcus Martin.
He was Marcus Martin. He was 2 people behind her. He reached and moved Marissa out of the way. He said to me,
his fiance,
he's cried over and over that he could not get to Heather. And I just said, Marcus, you can't help that. I have a photograph of the split second before he hits Heather. I have seen footage of him hitting Heather, but my brain will not absorb it even now. And to say that that is not criminal, that is not an offense. Since when do we allow the public to become judge, jury, and executioner? Because that's what this amounts to. Let's go hunt protesters.
Susan, what do you think is driving this?
Politics.
And let me bring Nick Robinson back into this conversation. The fact that so many dozens of bills are being introduced at once, a number in many states. And when we're talking about these motorists, we also are talking about police officers. I mean, there have been about 100 motorists running over protesters. in the last months. But if you can talk about, in several cases, police having used their cars as weapons against protesters, like in Detroit in June, an officer driving his police SUV through a crowd, sending protesters flying. 2 New York police officers did likewise at a Black Lives Matter protest May in 2020. Nick?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And we've also seen police, circulating on social media, pictures of drivers hitting protesters, seemingly encouraging drivers to run into protesters or to hit protesters with their car. And this just, it's just criminal. We not only see this as a problem, but we see a number of bills being introduced that would strengthen stand your ground laws and apply them anytime that people can show that there's a quote unquote riot occurring. So this applies in the Florida bill that just passed, or in Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi. So again, the ability to use deadly force against protesters. This is part of a larger movement by politicians that are introducing these bills that are trying to paint all protesters as rioters, and particularly all Black Lives Matter protesters as rioters.
And how do they make the distinction between Black Lives Matter protesters and insurrectionists, like the domestic terrorists in Washington, D.C., overrunning the Capitol, beating police officers, for example? How do they make that distinction so they don't hold them accountable?
Yeah, so I think the assumption here is these are kind of back the blue bills often. So they're often passed with a whole number of provisions that would do things like stop the defunding of local police departments, and so they're seen as supporting the police. And so I think they view them as being applied by the police in a certain type of way, right? There's these incredibly subjective standards about what's a quote-unquote riot. And so when you have that standard, the real concern is that if you have police that seem to be having certain ideological predilections, that they'll be applied in one way against certain kinds of protesters and in a different way against other kinds of protesters.
I want to give Susan the last word. Susan Bro, what do you say to the mothers of this country? What do you say to people who want to go out in the streets like Heather did as she protested fascism and white supremacy 3 years ago?
Well, obviously, the protests then were not enough. I guess we need more, but we're going to have to be strategic. I think there's going to have to be a lot of legal work done, but unfortunately, the courts are packed conservatively right now. I don't know how this is going to go.
Well, again, our condolences. I want to thank you, Susan Bro, for joining us today, mother of Heather Heyer, president of the Heather Heyer Foundation. Her daughter was run over by a white supremacist at the white supremacist march that took place over the weekend at the University of Virginia in the streets of Charlottesville. And Nick Robinson, International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. When we come back, President Biden acknowledges the Armenian genocide. Stay with us.
I'd like to run and jump on your solid
I'd like to walk around in your mind by Vashti Bunyan. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. You can watch, listen, and read transcripts using our iOS and Android apps. Download them for free from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store today. President Biden has made history by explicitly describing the 1915 massacre of Armenians by Ottoman Turks as a genocide. Biden issued the statement Saturday to mark Armenian Remembrance Day. He wrote, quote, "Over the decades, Armenian immigrants have enriched the United States in countless ways, but they've never forgotten the tragic history." He said, "We honor their story. We see that pain. We affirm the history. We do this not to cast blame, but to ensure that what happened is never repeated." He went on to say, the American people honor all those Armenians who perished in the genocide that began 160 years ago today, unquote. On April 24, 1915, the Ottoman Empire began a systematic, premeditated campaign targeted the Armenian people, an unarmed Christian minority living under Turkish rule. More than 1 million Armenians were exterminated through direct killings, starvation, torture, and forced death marches. Another 1 million fled into permanent exile. Biden's just the second U.S. president after Ronald Reagan to describe the mass killings as genocide. Turkey decried Biden's decision and summoned the U.S. ambassador in Ankara in protest. For decades, Turkey has lobbied lawmakers in Washington to avoid calling the massacres genocide. This is a spokesperson for Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
First of all, the statement by the U.S. President is very unfortunate, unfair. We completely reject it, condemn it. It is not supported by historical facts. It has no legal basis. And politically speaking, it's an irresponsible, unconstructive statement.
But Armenians have welcomed President Biden's statement, recognizing the genocide.
We are thankful that Joe Biden, in his first year after presidency, has already acknowledged the genocide, used the correct term, shared our sorrow, and also made an appeal to the world that such hate crimes, such crimes against humanity shouldn't be forgotten.
We're joined now by Peter Balakian, professor of humanities in the Department of English at Colgate University. He's the author of The Burning Tigris, The Armenian Genocide and America's Response. In 2016, Professor Balakian won a Pulitzer Prize for his poetry collection, Ozone Journal. His new article for The Washington Post is headlined, "To Armenians, Biden's recognition of the genocide means the world." Talk about what it means, Professor Balakian.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's good to be with you. It's an important statement for many reasons. And first one needs a little bit of context here, because the Turkish government's campaign, and I'll quote the distinguished international legal scholar Richard Falk, the Turkish government's campaign is a major, proactive, deliberate government effort to use every possible instrument of persuasion at its disposal to keep the truth about the Armenian genocide from general acknowledgement, especially by elites in the United States and Western Europe. So our listeners need to get a sense of how extreme the Turkish government's efforts to deny history, then by subsequent act to demonize the victims in order to rehabilitate themselves, how extreme this propaganda campaign has been. And so it's been important for other nations to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, often by legislative resolution. And I'm happy to say the U.S. government did this. Both the Senate and the House did this in the fall of 2019, joining 30 other countries in Europe, the Middle East, and South and North America. So there's been a worldwide rejection, and I think I could even call it a kind of ethical outrage against Turkey's denialism. And so President Biden has now added an important voice to a world movement. And because the The U.S. is such a major power, and President Biden has become, in such a short time, a really important moral leader, bringing the U.S. back into its moral force as a nation in the community of nations. This statement carries a lot of ethical weight and, again, a redress to a very corrupt and what I would call an immoral campaign to, deny history and perpetrate a kind of violence against the survivor community.
In a moment, I want to ask you to read one of your poems, but can you give us the background? I talked a little about what the Armenian genocide looked like, but explain to us what happened.
Well, using the cover of World War I, a little bit the way the Nazis used the cover of World War II, as a screen behind which they could execute a campaign to exterminate, to eliminate a targeted minority group, a hated minority group that the ruling party, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the Committee of Union and Progress Party, the Unionist Party, deemed the Armenians to be an obstreperous minority group that was clamoring for civil rights and equal treatment for Christians and Jews under Ottoman law. This was a big part of the Armenian civil rights project from the 1890s down through the 19-teens. Armenians were pushing the political envelope, asking for some major change inside Ottoman Turkey. And this was met with massacre as putative act, especially in the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. But when the war broke out, the ruling elite in Turkey decided they had an opportunity to eliminate the entire Armenian population, a population of between 2 and 2.5 million people who were living on their indigenous homelands, as were the Greeks and the Assyrians, the two other major Christian populations of the Ottoman Empire, living on their indigenous homelands. And it's worth noting that both other Christian minority populations, Assyrians and Greeks, were also wiped out. Before World War I and its aftermath was over, about 4 million Christians disappeared from Turkey. And so the plan was systematic, and it started with the arrest of the Armenian cultural and intellectual leaders on the night of April 24 in Istanbul, then Constantinople, and it involved the implementation of parliamentary acts, military intervention, mobilization of killing squads in order to arrest and deport every Armenian family from Turkey between 1915 and probably, I would say, the end of the summer of 1916, when about 1.2 million Armenians were killed. More would be killed in the ensuing years, and another 1 million would be exiled. Rape, abduction, forced conversion took the lives of another 200,000 Armenian women and children in particular. So this was an important event in the history of modern human rights atrocities. And it is significant that Adolf Hitler said 8 days before invading Poland in 1939, who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. Hitler learned something from this event.
Professor Balakian, could you read your poem after the survivors are gone?
Oh, happy to. I suppose the assumption behind a poem like this is that historical memory matters for many reasons: personal, ethical, humane, and I hope this poem picks up a little of that. After the survivors are gone, I tried to imagine the Vilna ghetto, to see a persimmon tree after the flash at Nagasaki. Because my own tree had been hacked, I tried to kiss the lips of Armenia. At the table and the altar, we said some words written ages ago. Have we settled for just the wine and bread, for candles lit and snuffed? Let us remember how the law has failed us. Let us remember the child naked, waiting to be shot on a bright day, with tulips blooming around the ditch. We shall not forget the earth, the artifact, the particular song, the dirt of an idiom, things that stick in the ear.
Peter Balakian is the Pulitzer Prize-winning Armenian-American poet and professor at Colgate University. Before we go, since you are a professor, can you briefly, we just have about 30 seconds or a minute, talk about Turkey's success in colonizing American universities, endowing chairs that would then, these professors would deny the Armenian genocide? And does this continue through to today?
Well, there was a movement by the Turkish government to do this, and we saw its most virulence in the 1990s. This happened at Princeton University with a scholar who was, or an alleged scholar who was hired to promote this denial project in the academy. I'm happy to say that so much good scholarship by so many scholars worldwide has so eroded and rebuffed Turkish denial that today Turkish denial is a laughing stock. The Turkish government is a laughing stock in the face of the rest of the world. And it would be so important for Turkey to move forward, to stop the denialism, to let go of this racist hate project against its ethnic minority cultures, including the Kurds today, to start embracing democracy, human rights, and diversity. The fact that Turkey has more journalists in jail than any country in the world over the last several decades, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, tells us something. And so
we're going to have to leave it there. But Professor Balakian, we thank you so much for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning Armenian-American poet, professor at Colgate University, his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Ozone Journal. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.